Good evening. Thank you for coming to this important event tonight. Many people don't want to miss it because it happens only once in 40 years. Hi, my name is Lydia Liu. I'm the director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. On behalf of the Institute, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests on this panel and to our colleagues and students who are here. We gather here to celebrate a book that was published 40 years ago, a book that has since transformed numerous academic fields and disciplines in the United States and around the world. And this is, of course, the English translation of French philosopher Jacques Derrida's of Grammatology by our dear colleague, University Professor Gayatri Spivak. Many of us read or studied this text back in graduate school, and this is the copy I have, is the second copy I have owned of the original edition. And if a translation can be said to be an event, Spivak's translation has been a watershed event in contemporary philosophy and across humanistic studies. Tonight, we're gathered here also to celebrate the publication of Spivak's new 40th anniversary edition of Grammatology by Johns Hopkins University Press. We have invited a panel of distinguished scholars, and of course, including the author translator herself, all are foremost thinkers in the fields. And we have invited them to reflect on the importance of Derrida's work and life, and the importance of this translation. This panel will be moderated by Suleiman Bashir Diane, who is also a member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society and chair of the French department. And there will be a book signing following the discussion. And then also between the panel discussion and the Q&A, there will be a piano recital. In the middle, by Johann Riepert. Before I invite our Executive Vice President David Madigan to the podium to give his formal opening remarks, I want to say that the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society is very proud to host this event as we pay tribute to the extraordinary achievements of one of our founding directors. And as a testimony to the enduring and broad impact of Spivak's work as a thinker, translator, teacher, and social activist, many departments, centers, and institutes around the campus have shown their enthusiastic support, and you'll find their co-sponsorship gratefully acknowledged in the back of printed program. So I will not give you a recitation of so many units across the campus. But I should note that the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought in Law School is also our co-sponsor, and its name was accidentally omitted from the printed program. Finally, I would like to thank the following individuals for their generosity and support. Dean Sharon Marcus, David Friedberg, Barbara Vida, Paul Leclerc, Eileen Giluli, Sulan Bashir Diaz, Sarah Cole, I don't know if she's here, Peter Connor, Carlos Alonso, Fred Neuhauser, Mamadou Diouf, Bernard Harcourt, Akil Begrani, Shani Pierre, Matthew McAdam, and Sarah Monks. I have just learned that we have a special guest from the French Embassy, Deputy Culture Counselor Thomas Michelon. Welcome to Columbia University. And now I would like to invite Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of Columbia University, David Madigan, to make his opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming David to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see so many people here, and I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to make a few brief remarks, and then we'll get on with the panel. So University Professor Gayatri Spivak was the first translator of Derrida's major works into English, opening up his ideas, particularly those challenging structuralism and establishing deconstructive practice to a new audience. Before her translation in 1976, several of Derrida's essays had been translated, but among American academics, his ideas were only known to a rather small group who had come to him mostly through the original. Spivak's translation and introduction sparked new critical attention to Derrida, broadening his audience and shifting the trajectory of American literary theory. Of Grammatology, that Lydia just held up, a foundational text for deconstructive criticism, was seminal for the post-structuralism movement. It directly engages and challenges the structuralist thesis and its proponents, Saussure and Lévi-Strauss, who had been dominating English and American literary studies up to that point. Moving beyond structuralism and forging a new path, Derrida deconstructs the implicit assumptions and philosophies underlying Western texts, proposing a methodology of reading with suspicion. From the mid-1970s onward, the dialogue with Derrida hasn't lapsed, and Spivak's role in fostering the conversation cannot be understated. At the time of the translation, the original translation, Spivak was a young academic teaching at the University of Iowa. After commencing the project in 1973, she traveled to France to discuss the book with Jacques Derrida himself. The following year at Brown University, Spivak taught a seminar on Derrida and articulated through dialogue the ideas of the preface. The careful translation, done in consultation with Derrida experts and discussed with Derrida himself, was foundational, establishing her academic reputation and practice. The influential translator's preface situated Derrida in context, examining him amongst his antecedents and contemporaries. It brought the reader, whether student or established scholar, into the text's conversations, demonstrating where Derrida is working against commonly held assumptions. It also established the importance of Derrida's critical vocabulary. Spivak's literalism, her meticulous rendition of Derrida's terms and phrases, created a new set of terms in the English language that broadened our thinking, long constrained by the history implicit in old terminology. Since this early translation, Spivak's academic career and her international reputation has flourished. She has been a pioneer in establishing deconstruction, post-colonialism, and feminism within academia. She has directed our attention to the subalterns, particularly oppressed female colonial subjects, almost single-handedly establishing the practice in literary theory of studying non-Western women. She has left a lasting legacy everywhere she went. During her Iowa teaching position, she founded the MFA in English translation. At Columbia, while ceaselessly making a lasting impact on her students and colleagues year after year and publishing prodigiously, she was responsible for founding the Center, now Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. She has written 9 books and countless significant articles, completed 5 translations, and received numerous honorary doctorates and awards. Since her original translation, Derrida has remained a cornerstone for academic studies. This 40th anniversary edition, that Lydia also held up, a careful retranslation of Derrida's work with an eye towards his legacy, supplements the original and is complemented by Judith Butler's introduction. It will help us to continue to innovate on Derrida's foundation for years to come. On a slightly less serious note, I just want to say it's been wonderful to get to know Gayatri in the last few years in my current position. And she's just a delightful colleague and fabulous to have here. And one thing that you possibly don't know is she's also a whole lot of fun. So, thank you, Gayatri.
Hello, good afternoon. I have been introduced. I'm Souleymane Bachir Diagne. I'm currently the chair of the French department. I have the impossible task of moderating this. I call my task impossible because I have a very, very tight schedule. Let me run through the schedule. I will say a few words, so I will keep those short. to give an example of discipline. And then the 5 wonderful panelists here are going to go in deeply into the new translation of grammatology and the magnificent postface in particular, all the preface, everything. But they will have only 15 minutes each to do that, because at 5:45, after the 5 panelists have say a few words, Johan Rippert will be playing the piano for us for 15 minutes. Johan is a wonderful student of ours, student of Gayatri and myself, and we are very happy to have him in the French department and to have such a talent in music in the French department. And then after that musical interlude, you will have the floor for just 15 minutes again for a Q&A, for some exchange that you will continue after those 15 minutes with Gayatri as she signs her book for you. This is the reason why we have to end the Q&A at 6:15, and Gayatri will be signing her book, and we have to keep this schedule because there is a flight at one point to be taken by somebody at this table later this evening. So as I promised, I will keep my own preliminary remarks short. I just take the time to thank Lydia and Gayatri for asking me to be a moderator for this wonderful gathering of friends. Obviously, it's an honor for me, so I'm happy because this is an honor. I'm also happy because I did not have to fight for a seat at this wonderful gathering. So congratulations to you all who have got a seat at this celebration, and happy 40th anniversary. My few words of remark would be about what I call l'effet de miroir, the mirror effect, as Jacques Derrida spent most of his life crossing the Atlantic back and forth between France and the United States. In other words, what I'm interested in is not just the reception of Derrida in the US, thanks in particular to Gayatri's work, but the French reception now of the American reception of Jacques Derrida. This should be a very interesting field to explore. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is read in the most recent, the only French biography, by the way, of Jacques Derrida, the account, the report about what Gayatri's work did back in 1976. So in that biography of Jacques Derrida, translation and reception are described in the following words. A young woman of Indian origin, Gayatri Spivak, plays a decisive role in the reception of Derrida in the US. Coming from Calcutta in 1961, she prepares a thesis under the supervision of Paul Demont before she discovers, so the text says in French, avec émerveillement, before she discovers in wonderment de la grammatologie. Gayatri Spivak devotes many years to that extremely delicate translation. She comes to Paris in the summer of 1973, meets Derrida many times, submitting to him the difficulties she was encountering. In 1974-75, she gives at Brown University, Providence, a seminar on Derrida, which will be the point of departure of the long introduction she added to her translation before it was published by Johns Hopkins Press in 1976. That text of about 100 pages, and now I emphasize, definitely more accessible than the work to which it was prefaced, will serve as a textbook for generations of American students. And then the biographer of Jacques Derrida gives a quote from François Cussé, who wrote this book, French Theory, saying this: "From that year, 1976, what is then simply a theoretical program will be read, studied, and soon put to work in certain graduate literature classes, especially at Yale and Cornell. Deconstruction starts being applied," Cussé's emphasis, and we know that Derrida would have hated the word applied, but deconstruction starts being applied as are drawn from it the modalities of a new close reading of literary classics, and as are scrutinized the mechanism by which the referent dissipates, dissolves, the content is ceaselessly differed by the writing itself. Of course, this account may not be accurate. I haven't verified the dates with Gayatri, and I hardly imagine you running around Cornell in wonderment reading after having read de la Grammatology, but after all, you will tell me. But it says certainly something very true about what Gayatri's translation has done, shaping fields in which many of us work. And for that, we have to be grateful to you, Gayatri. Her preface, in particular, did something just wonderful, to still use the word wonder here. And I think that we have to thank you and your publisher. I don't know who decided to keep the preface. I'm sure you were ready to leave it alone and just transform your postface into a new preface, doing something Kant did, after all, having the second preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. We are happy that you did not do that, that the preface was kept, because somehow it doesn't belong to you anymore. You did not have the right, I believe, not to keep the same preface written by the fearless, how did he say it, the fearless young woman who came from Calcutta in 1961. But instead, you wrote this wonderful postface in which you said something I didn't know, actually. The decision you made writing that preface to replace systematically he, the masculine pronoun used by Jacques Derrida, by a she when talking about the philosopher, and that simple way of adding the S of sex to the he that was used, turning it into a she, has done a tremendous job. And I am sure that the panelists here on this table are going to describe in more detail and depth that wonderful job that you did. Thank you. Thank you. It is my pleasure now to ask Ben Baer to say a few words. Ben Baer is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton University, a student of Gayatri. I should have started with that. And he's also an executive member of Princeton's program in South Asian studies. He works in Marxism, deconstruction, postcolonial literature and theory, translation, and subaltern predicaments. And it is my pleasure, Ben, to ask you to.
One of the most important and valuable aspects of grammatology today, almost half a century after its first publication and 40 years after the first English translation, is the easiest to state and the hardest to practice. Let's state it at the outset, at least, as clearly as possible, in Derrida's own words. We do not have the ambition of illustrating a new method, he tells us, right at the start in the avertissement, putting us on the alert, giving a heads up. We've attempted to produce the problems of critical reading, often embarrassing ourselves in the process. Of Grammatology will instruct us by example in the linkage between these two threads. To produce the problem of critical reading is necessarily to stop short of illustrating a new method. How so? Because harnessing and being harnessed by all the resources of your disciplinary formation, you must yet still abandon yourself to the thing being read. A double injunction that demands the impossible of the scholar, the literary critic, the philosopher. Yoke yourself then to the text, as Derrida calls it, generously expanding the term beyond words and language, and correspondingly questioning the fantasies of mastery embodied by philology and linguistics. An initial exercise of what Derrida calls radical empiricism may, there are no guarantees here, it may lead the reader beyond the orbit of his or her methodological or disciplinary enclosure. Will following Derrida here help us to glimpse the outlines of a different kind of comparative literature for a globalizing world? Let's at least entertain the possibility. Now, a grammatology reread for today will undoubtedly unfold a number of urgent questions and observations that concern our digitized and globalized contemporaneity, the political dreamworks of new micro and macro vanguards everywhere, and the ethnocentric anti-ethnocentrism that now runs the world and shakes the universities. But I do not believe that any of these exciting and compelling things are vividly legible without some kind of passage through the problems of critical reading. It's actually more than just a matter of legibility. We're thinking about the possibility of developing new practices with which to question and change digital idealism, globalization, and self-excusing ethnocentrism from within. That's to say, not from the fantasy position of an untainted externality to them. And, following Derrida, this change from within can perhaps only come from work that itself inhabits the problems of critical reading, understood in a broad sense. By this, then, I don't simply mean the exegesis and analysis of works of literature and philosophy printed on the pages of books, though these are for academics in the humanities usually a professional first priority. Correspondingly, Derrida shows us his own moves of extremely careful, advanced, and traditional Rousseau scholarship in this book, and he cautions at every turn against supposing that it's easy or even possible simply to cross over into some place other than the traditional norms of scientificity operative in the disciplines. Yet, just as of grammatology rigorously expands and redefines the prevailing definitions of writing and text, so the fields in which the problems of critical reading play out expand with them. Critical reading, the basic fare of every literature teacher's and graduate student's ideal self-image. This is what we seem to want. It's easy to state and hard to do. Yet Derrida calls our attention toward the doing and its possible misfiring by saying, I have attempted to produce. The uncanny, exhilarating, and disconcerting unusualness of grammatology is that it does not disclose a method that could willy-nilly be applied to any text as a grid of intelligibility, as if it was giving us the ingredients for a manual of deconstructive reading. At many points, Derrida's reader is asked rather to suspend or hold back the desire for methodological instruction and immediate applicability, and to experience or traverse with the writer the problems of reading as writing as problems of habitation. To state a problematic or question so it can be known is, of course, a kind of practice. But I'd maintain, as I think Derrida would have, that inhabiting the problems in a certain way, which can mean getting caught up in them, is a qualitatively different thing, even as stating and inhabiting are not in a binary relation of exteriority to one another. Honouring those differences, forging their pathways, is part of the wager and the drama of grammatology. We have attempted to produce the problems of critical reading, often embarrassing ourselves in the process. Such embarrassment doesn't designate an affect or a psychological state, like shame or humiliation. It means to be hindered, prevented from moving, stymied in some way. Ma langue m'embarrasse says, I'm unable to articulate my point clearly. Recourse to etymology should, of course, be taken with a pinch of salt, but it's at least interesting in this case that embarazar is thought to have referred to the practice of leashing or binding animals. The leash as that which holds and yet permits a certain disciplined movement. Working to produce the problems of critical reading, Derrida will often find himself hampered, stymied, or troubled by the fact that he's obliged to operate from within the same logocentric and phonocentric presuppositions that he seeks to loosen. Hence, the refrain of Part 1, Chapter 3, without venturing up to that perilous necessity. What is that perilous necessity? It's the necessity of leaving the orbit of the inherited concepts and practices of the human sciences that, freighted with an immense and sedimented epistemological tradition, concern themselves with logics, origin and development, and essence, and with empirical modes of investigation. Derrida holds back from the perilous necessity of shaking off the disciplinary harness. He holds back from the perilous necessity of no longer sheltering in these millennially protective and productive structures. Because who cannot shelter there? Who can not shelter there? It is, as it were, only the master's tools that can dismantle the master's house. Of grammatology doesn't solve anything. It's the statement of a problem and a practical demonstration of its outline. In spite of this, we gather some reading protocols. Quote, the person writing is inscribed in a determined textual system. There are different relationships as to that which, from the signifier, is presented as the irreducible stratum of the signified. Reading should be aware of this project, he writes. That's to say, one has to learn in each and every idiom, every text, its specific mode of relating signifiers to signifieds. This protocol will travel a long way. The writer writes in a language and in a logic whose proper system, laws, and life his discourse by definition cannot dominate absolutely. He uses them only by letting himself, after a fashion and up to a point, be governed by the system, says Derrida. Derrida's Exhibit A, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is captured by the word supplement as much as he is able to harness it for his own ends. And the same goes for us, held by the words and signs that we invest or cathect. Hanging out in a certain way in the old structures of grammatology repeatedly refuses the avant-gardism that would claim to break through to the other side and discover in other social formations beyond European ethnocentrism alternative epistemologies, alternative modernities, alternative X's. Ethnocentrism everywhere and always has had to control the concept of writing, he writes. And a society without writing is an oxymoron. So, in Derrida's framework, gestures toward the innocence or non-culpability of such and such an alternative disclose themselves as pre-colonial golden ageisms, ethnocentric phantasms of peoples without writing, hallucinations of non-European alternatives, for example, what he calls the Chinese prejudice and the hieroglyphist prejudice, primitivisms of nature, animality, childhood, madness, divinity, etc. Those are his words. He holds such cases often to be instances of ethnocentric contempt appearing in the guise of hyperbolical admiration for the cultural systems of the non-European other. And we're still caught in the brackets of that epoch. An ethnocentrism with a benevolent smile that makes the world turn today. I'd like to underline that it's firstly the likes of us and himself, scholars of the human sciences, whom Derrida addresses with these remarks. It's our ethnocentrism he's talking about. Thus, as we globalize curricula and explore the universe of exciting interdisciplinary options, as we should and will continue to do, we might pay attention both to Derrida's monetary cautions and to his intellectual practice as a reader and writer. His monetary cautions warn of the bad faith of overinvestment in or overemphasis upon alternative epistemologies, when in fact we rely almost absolutely on the ones inherited from a Euro-American training. This is not to say don't do it, not to say don't try to get out of the orbit of the inherited disciplinary frame, let alone the metaphysical one. No, because in Derrida's practical demonstration, if I can put it like that, where he takes one of the most central and canonical figures in the modern French intellectual tradition, Rousseau, something else does seem to happen. After all the theoretical preparation and cautionary statements that we cannot venture up to that perilous necessity, Rousseau's text leads Derrida elsewhere. It resists the scholarly, methodological and theoretical preparation with which he approaches it, and by that resistance, by that drag, that friction, takes Derrida out of the orbit of the categories with which he approached it. A risky strategy, unmoored and with no final justification. We must begin where we are, writes Derrida, bearing in mind that it is impossible to justify a point of departure absolutely. This is the wager of the humanities. But let's not get too carried away. In an important turn, Derrida thought in the mid-1960s that a general writing, as it works in cybernetics, informatics, and genetic coding, had the potential to make metaphysics and logocentrism exceed themselves. He thus evokes an ineluctable world of the future, proclaiming itself beyond the closure of knowledge, announced and presented under the species of monstrosity, the unnameable glimmer beyond the closure, and a future glimpsed on condition of an epistemological liberation. The opening of this coming future is at one point given the name thinking or thought. Yet he cautions that thinking is exactly what we already know we have not yet begun to do. Knowing is not yet thinking, and knowing and doing are here in a relation of discrepancy. At a moment where knowledge as information is vastly more hyperinflated than in 1966, here is food for doing thought. I hope to have indicated some of the stakes of re-engaging with grammatology today. We began with the question of critical reading as a problem, but who reads? And who writes? The answers aren't simple. 23 years after Of Grammatology, Derrida would write the following in an essay on the politics of philosophical education. When we talk philosophy, we must always attempt to evaluate the number and place of all those who would understand nothing or little of all these potential or actual stakes. Billions of human beings. These differences are irreducible. They define the very field of political struggles for the progress of the rights of man and of democracy, and they have an essential relation to the experience of language, to education, and to the teaching of philosophy." Unquote. These billions, on the other hand, read us talkers in their own way. Imagine learning to read how we might be invested and presented as signifieds, even if only as a blank space in the signifying chains of the billions. It's a daunting task, shaking confidence in current political struggles for the progress of the rights of man and democracy, and also a perilous necessity that seems all the more imperative today. With this last point in mind, I'd like to conclude on a more narrowly disciplinary reflection about my own precinct concerning the practice of a globalized comparative literature in the wake of grammatology. Indeed, with its critical forays into the historiography of writing and comparative linguistics, of grammatology could be taken as an excellent primer in the European history and theory of our discipline. First, I spoke of embarrassment earlier as having a relationship to the restraint of a harness. This is what being in a disciplinary formation is. The restraint necessary to delimit an object of knowledge. Disciplines are what embarrass us, but we need them to know with. Therefore, an institutional and practical support for real interdisciplinarity can be the first step of a move toward the exorbitant and toward the task of thinking. Disciplinary norms and protocols can be the very means for moving their boundaries, as those norms and protocols become visible when disciplines are brought into contact, each discipline exceeding itself as it approaches the other. This situation calls for the extension of imaginative collaborative pedagogy and research with institutional support. Second, expansion of what constitutes a text. It's extraordinary to me that Derrida is so often read as somehow both disapproving in some stentorian way of speech and of turning everything into language. It's quite the reverse, and the systematic misapprehension of his effort here seems to me symptomatic of the resistance to the counterintuitive force of his thinking. Under such conditions, it seems well nigh impossible to open comparative literature, but we should try, to the radicality of what Derrida proposes in rethinking the relation between writing and speech, and also in thinking about the massive hybridity of all manner of signification systems, the realm of the picto-ideo-phonographic, as he puts it, for example. Among many other things, the study of orality would have to be brought to the centre of the discipline and not left to wither in the margins of underfunded and epistemologically impoverished oral history projects. Study of the continental flows of orality could at least potentialise a globalisation of comparative literature from below. We haven't even begun to imagine the institutional or disciplinary protocols for this kind of work, which would call both for inspired commitment to language learning and teaching and for the rethinking of literary, linguistic and imaginative pedagogies and geographies. Finally, once more, a check and reminder about what Derrida calls ethnocentrism in the consciousness of a living progressivism. Sometimes inclusion and the addition from the margins of more geographic coverage to curricular offerings are taken as in themselves benignly progressive gestures. And we cannot not include. But as Derrida has often warned, apparent inclusion can all too easily mean the maintenance of an outside on the inside. Must the global margins present themselves in recognisable form in order to get a hearing at all? Or must they run the risk of being fetishised for their very unintelligibility and thus of being benignly contained, held up only for their difference on the other side of a limit? An ever-renewed of grammatology can help us learn that it's ways of doing, knowing and thinking that we need, as much as an accumulation of information from the new global margins and centres. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Our next speaker will be Professor Avital Ronell, who is a university professor of the humanities at New York University, and she is the Jacques Derrida Professor of Philosophy and Media at the European Graduate School in Switzerland. Let me just say that she wrote, among her many writings, she wrote and performed a critical autothanatography at How 3, that's how you pronounce it?
How Dry.
How Dry, of course, in Berlin, entitled What Was I Thinking? A spectral colloquy about the one-night stand of hermeneutics and deconstruction, of which she claims to have been the illegitimate result. So
Illegitimate. Okay, you got me. I was kicking back thinking I had a few predecessors, but thank you very much, all of you, for being here, for inviting my participation at this table. I translated myself today from downtown in order to honor my friends here, former students, future students, my advisory boards, and of course, Gayatri, for whom I've had, since my academic tweenage, the greatest tenderness and friendship. So, I don't know about you, but I've been feeling really crappy lately. And I've been crying a lot. And I'm not a crybaby. So I thought maybe I would refer myself, since I am a switchboard operator, very often I patch into certain calls, and Grammatology opens up by launching a call from being or to being in the Heideggerian sense, an aphonic call, even a Gewissensruf, or a call of conscience. So I thought I'd dial up that part of Grammatology that might weep with me and say something about crying and allow me to be a deliverer of some theory if I can't come up with theory today. One of my fellow theoreticians is Werner Hamacher, who just took off to Frankfurt from downtown New York. Oh, by the way, when students in my seminars give reports, which I've snuffed out, by the way, and they often start quoting Gayatri Spivak, I say, wait a minute, guys. There are 2 queens in New York City. Okay, there are many queens in New York City. One rules uptown and the other one is downtown. So let's take that again. But I'm thinking Schiller's Mary, Queen of Scots here. I submit myself, not to the other queen, but to the queen. So, crying a lot, I decided that I'd get a direct link to, or line to, crying in Grammatology, and with reading with 2 eyes, with the translation. And recently, by the way, I was teaching Derrida, and I asked someone, do you think the class would appreciate the French? And they said, now, this is talk about American imperialism. We don't need the translation. We'll read it in English. And even with my perverse love of the Benjaminian, turnaround, I couldn't get my head around that in order to deliver a good smackdown. But I give up sometimes. So I decided to find out where the cri-écrit, the schreiben schrei, the inscribing cry, that writing in Heidegger and then Derrida jamming on that might be in Grammatology, which grammatology, and by the way, there is an applied grammatology by Greg Ulmer, which takes the off-ramp to media studies. I don't know what Jacques might have thought of that, and by the way, also, we were here, I think, some of us, with Derrida in this very room, so he's welcome back in a phantomal and real sense right now. So I decided to check it out in the other book of books of Grammatology, which Derrida says is already in translation. It's already a translative effort to move from something like the phantasms that Ben so richly elaborated of the pure word to écriture. There's an internal fishing and translation taking place already in of Grammatology. So this is, in a sense, it became and was quickly maybe misappropriated, expropriated, or assumed and shouldered the responsibility of being the other book of books, even as, or maybe because it destroys the sovereignty of the book, putting écriture into play and smashing certain, let's say, prejudicial tendencies that allow us still to refer ourselves without too much static on the line to something like a book. So Derrida put out a call for the destruction of the book, but this has to be understood as a certain, in Heidegger there's a difference between destruction and devastation. Devastation has no pledge to futurity. It just is toxic destruction, whereas destruction, which comes from Nietzsche, is a clearing and destroying what is already destructive. Yes, there's the call. So Derrida did something to the book whose destruction I've tried to track and enact and work with by taking a call in a certain way that still compels me. Now, I said I was a weepy crybaby these last weeks, so I went to the part of de la Grammatologie where there's a regulated instability of the judgments on childhood, and this would be the Rousseau fold of the text. And I was surprised after all these years to rediscover that Derrida, hitching a ride with Rousseau, had a lot to say about crying. Not in a Heideggerian sense necessarily. I don't know if we can imagine Heidegger shedding a tear. And tearlessness is another track that I try to take when thinking about war, and which presidential warmongers made it a point of something like honor, desecrated of course, to insist on a rhetoric of tearlessness. So let me say that I was jolted, or I received a Heideggerian Stoß, a kind of prod or provocation or wake-up call to find out that of Grammatology works with children and infancy and reinscribes the philosophical claims on childhood. One of my questions in my work, and also reading the work of others, is when did the child crawl into philosophical HQ headquarters? I was thinking about this in terms of Lyotard, especially on his thought of the unrelenting creepiness of childhood. When it came to language and what he calls the mammies. In other words, dependency is too weak a term to describe certain hostage taking that children are subjected to. So in the work that I kind of was able to consider in terms of grammatology, I was moved to reflect on the place and status of the idiot child and the wild child, the unteachable, unreachable, the breached who break into human understanding and a first encounter with language, Kaspar Hauser style, or according to the impossible protocols of breakthrough linguisticity established by Helen Keller. What was the philosophical urgency among the empiricists, Diderot and co., Wordsworth, bestowed upon the idiot? Because for these thinkers, childhood and crying and pre-language stabs at expression had everything to do with what human understanding was before it became, let's say, domesticated or codified or hyper-codified and established idioms and topologies that we think we recognize. So let me just say a few words, because we were only given a few minutes to cry or jubilate today, which is part of the same experience in Rousseau and Derrida on Rousseau. And in the case of the child that Derrida brings up in this text, parler avant de savoir parler. So the child who talks before knowing how to talk is something extremely troubling and still very important in terms of mapping out a kind of, or reading a certain kind of grammatological predicament. So for Rousseau, and this is in the French on page 350, in the translation we have it on page 270. Let me just say that the crying baby is somewhere between animality and humanity, between inarticulation and articulation, between the lower, let's say, parts of being and the Godhead, and a kind of very careful thinking of pain that Rousseau and Derrida and grammatology therefore take off from. Something about crying that is the startup engine for human expressivity and a relation to language, a vital relation to language, is what the child brings to us. But the promise that Rousseau holds out is that once the child, whether it's somehow installed in history or in us, in the effort to translate unspeakable, unbearable pain, once the child learns to speak and therefore is also corrupted and also is given over to the pollution and kind of dreary codifications of articulation, which is a bad thing, actually. Once that happens and the child goes into that region of language acquisition and understanding where she depends on supplementarity and substitution, once the child exchanges the tear for signs and traces that language endows us with, the douleur or the pain will stop, unless, says Rousseau, cited by Derrida, the pain becomes so enormous that, again, crying might reignite. So language is a way of stifling and stuffing the strange, and by the way, very contemporary in scientific circles, enigma of crying. Crying serves no biological or otherwise understandable service, and Darwin had a lot to say about how ineffectual it is and unreadable it is. But for Rousseau, it's that moment of speaking sans savoir parler, which is good news for the kid. This is, Derrida writes, cela peut être mis à son crédit. So this is good news, but once the child starts needing supplementarity, alterity, difference, which is what language is, something happens to that pain so that one would have to go back to a kind of Nietzschean genealogical purge to find out where it went, if we could have a tracking system and find out where that went once language and or écriture got installed. So this is something that Derrida goes through with great precision, and that the translation, of course, picks up as well. But the problem with the child who finally emerges out of the spheres and crushed space of pure crying is that it doesn't yet know how to sing. And that means it's not yet human, it's not yet poetic, and I think that's where I'm at right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Avital. Our next speaker is Mireille Calle-Gruber. Mireille is professor at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3. She is also a writer, a novelist. She has both a career as a professor and also a diplomat, because she served as attaché of French Foreign Affairs and had missions to Germany, Italy, Egypt, Czechoslovakia. She was professor at Queen's University, Canada, and she is a member of the Royal Society of Canada since 1997. Among her many books, I will just single out Jacques Derrida, La distance généreuse. Mireille, c'est à vous.
Thank you. I would like first to thank Gayatri for this invitation and express my pleasure to participate to this great event this evening. And I would like also to beg your pardon for my English, and I thank you for your patience. The 2016 edition of Jacques Derrida's of Grammatology, presenting a newly revised translation by Gayatri Spivak, is accompanied by a series of paratexts, which make us aware that more than one hand and quite a lot of gestures are at work, thus rereading and paying tribute to Derrida's thought. 3 of them are of particular interest to me, and I have retained my attention today. I call them the heart's hand, the ear's hand, the lips' hand. The heart's hand. Any text is an envoi, an address. Any text is a letter to the beloved. When Marx and Engels are writing the capital, they are writing a letter to the beloved. When Saint Therese of Avila is writing, she is writing a letter to the beloved. End of quote. Marie-Josée Monzin quotes these words of Jean-Luc Godard during a discussion with Jacques Derrida in 2002. Derrida thus answers, I am convinced, like him, that the capital is the letter to the beloved. Obviously, we are a few to think this way. I believe indeed that any text is in a certain way a love letter. End of quote. In turn, I pick up again the statement, I believe in the amorous dimension of writing texts, and I suggest that the translation, a book translated, is a request or a declaration of love. Of Grammatology is a love letter which endeavors to answer, to co-answer, to De la Grammatologie, which is itself a love letter. Numerous questions are immediately raised. Since De la Grammatologie, as we know, Derrida has analyzed, especially in the monolingualism of the other, his love relationship to the French language in the French language. His approach is passionate. It is about coaxing the sentences, that is to say, I quote him, loving by setting on fire, burning. His approach is that of the stranger as a stranger, this, I quote, newcomer without assignable origin, by which is displayed an idiomatic becoming, a desire to have an idioma. Above all, Derrida's approach is experimental, an experiment, crossing out, repetition, up to the point of the indecidable, by which it is important, I quote, to make something happen to this language, end quote. Gayatri knows that translating is performing the happening of the language within the language, the other. The language which does not happen to itself, deferred, constantly carried away in the movement of writing which informs it. It is actually the principle itself of deconstruction, which Gayatri reminds us in the afterword, I quote her, "The enterprise of deconstruction is always in a certain way swept away in its own work." Derrida's essay, What is a Relevant Translation, published in 2004, opens itself in similar terms. This essay acknowledges the gestures of translation in another way, that is, from the position of the one who is not the translator but translated, and as such, indebted. And from the position of the one who, while reading, writing, keeps feeling, putting oneself to the test, performing or operating the untranslatable. In other words, from, I quote Derrida, the other face of a jealous and admiring love, a passion for what summons, loves, provokes, and defies, translation while running up an infinite debt in its service, an admiration for those men and women who, to my mind, are the only one who know how to read and write, translators. End of quote. This is a beautiful tribute, which also provides a different way of reconsidering the question of grammatology, a different way of dealing with letters, alphabets, syllabations, reading and writing, in short, with the science of writing, not by the means of meta-language, but in the unstable zone between language and meta-language of the transactional play of words. What is at stake here is a passion for translation in all meanings of the word, a grammar, a lexicon, a philosophy of the word. What counts is to spread the word. Thus, Derrida clarifies the singular idiomatic work on the word, I quote, "That is where a passion for translation comes to lick it as a flame or an amorous tongue might, approaching as closely as possible while refusing at the last moment to threaten or to reduce, to consume or to consummate, leaving the other body intact, but not without causing the other to appear on the very brink of this refusal or withdrawal, and after having aroused or excited the desire for the idiom, for the unique body of the other, in the flame's flicker or through a tongue's caress. I don't know how or in how many languages you can translate this word, lécher, when you wish to say that one language licks another one, like a flame or a caress." End of quote. Through these translations, by comparisons, through these metaphors and homophones, for example, langue is both language and tongue, Derrida underlines the double bind of the translator's gesture, which is destined to almost translate, to confront itself to the impossible possible of translation, to confront itself to the possible betrayal which goes with any love relationship, a possible betrayal at the never-ending possible. This double bind consists in translating at the nearest while respecting the withdrawal. More precisely, to renounce reducing the other amounts to making his, her otherness appear, his, her untranslatability appear. Translating while showing the untranslatable of the irreducible body corpus. That is, that the eyes of language are destined for crying as much as for reading. The tongue of language is destined to caress instead of mastering. The edge of the lips of the tongue is destined for the last word, the eschaton. Gayatri, who organizes the scene of translation through the play between the preface and the afterword, displays this double bind of translation perfectly well. Thus, she is attentive to the exercise itself of the preface and to the illusion of the original text, whereas what she calls the fiction of preface is an aftertext. She also mistrusts the illusion of an achieved translation and of an afterword that would be conclusive. By proceeding this way, to translate is to call the password. Each word is a shibboleth, which signals that there is unpronounceability and ambivalence. In his essay Shibboleth for Paul Celan, Derrida recalls the verses of the German poet. 13th of February, in the heart's mouth, an awakened shibboleth. To translate is to go search for the words in the heart's mouth. In the heart beating, in the rhythm of the Derridian prosody. Actually, Gayatri resorts to the word funky from jazz music to designate the funky kind of reading that Derrida proposes. An on-beat, offbeat, backbeat structure, she writes. This, for me, wakens the echo of Derrida's behest in Circumfection, I quote, giving to be read the interruption. By proceeding this way, the preface and the afterword keep taking the measure of the multiple measurements of translation's generous distance, and by doing this, they keep taking the risk of showing the hand of the translator. A hand which crosses out, which notes alterations and retouchings, which shakes, but also countersigns. This hand gives, I quote Gayatri, always already a preface between two hands is holding open a book. End of quote. The preface and the afterword form a kind of translation of the translation, an endless chain. The translation holds out its hand, like the poetic gesture, according to Levinas, for whom a poem and a handshake are equivalent. Also, like the Derridian gesture of waving one's hand, or also like the helpful gesture of transmission to the readers to come, of the democracy to come, of reading and writing. This would be the truth of translation, a hand which risks itself, which stakes life on it. The ear's hand. Translation also requires a hand of hearing. So, the other's text in the other language waves a tympanum, which endeavors to make the signifier of the signifier's sound. Translation tympanizes the original text. It is a frontiers issue, a question of limits, the proper and the stranger, of passage. Gayatri notices that it regards in particular the problem with homophones that cannot be translated word to word. Thus, for the word trace, Gayatri chooses, I quote, I stick to trace in my translation because it looks the same as Derrida's word. In other words, she singles out literality, which enables to hear with the eyes, as Nietzsche says. I jump. The lips hands. The third hand of grammatology translation is the edge of the lips, where the last breath comes at the limit with the last word, eschaton. Circumfection whispers the word to me at the beginning of the period 5, I quote, I posthume as I breathe. From the perspective of the posterity of Derrida's work, this expression could be reformulated in this way. I posthume as they breathe, they, the translations. The impossible and endless translations, which lie as much as they breathe, but which give a new breath, give survival to the work. I jump. Also, it amounts saying that the question of the subject, who writes, who rewrites, who performs, is central, and that it's the center of a certain viduity. It is precisely this emptiness of the subject which does not happen to itself that Derrida points in his expression, I posthume as I breathe. The grammatically impossible subject gives, in his painfully ironical manner, a final lesson, that's in Questioning Judaism. Emptied of an unlikely identity, the pronoun I makes some room for the ultimate breath of the words, for the eschaton. And like no one else, says Derrida in Circumfession, I have made the eschaton into a coat of arms of my genealogy, the lips edge of my truth. End of quote. For the expression, the last of the last, designate the end as well as the survivance again. The end without end, the last of the Jews, the last of the eschatologists, and also the last words of the last words on the lips of the philosopher's dying mother who does not die, carried by this endless period, which is a sentence that survives itself, the words of the mother which torment him, he, the impossible subject, ventriloquized by her, who am I, says the mother. The question is heartrending. First, because in French, the homophones suivre et être resonate. Second, because it stages the scene of writing to death, but also because it could be the question of the translator par excellence, the question of translation itself, of this never-ending process of translating which instills life and drives to ruins, posthumous and eschaton. On the edge of the lips of translation, what is reenacted is the operation of circumcision, this wound in language, as Derrida says. Derrida will have been writing about this all along in all of his texts, the steps of the limits, the marges, the marks, the words full of words and languages, the pharmakos. Derrida asserts in his interview with Elisabeth Weber, I quote, "The straightforward act of speaking establishes us from the outset in the alliance of circumcision in general." End of quote. The 1974 preface opened itself on the acknowledgement of a necessary gesture of homage and parricide. End of quote. The 2016 afterword closes on a parenthesis and on these words, I quote, "In 2001, at a public seminar at NYU, Derrida chided me for not having modified the standard translations of the text he cited and read, when they clearly did not follow the original. If you think I have modified them too much in this version, put it down to a private piety in memoriam." End of quote. As if the work of translation of a text implied the retranslation of the whole libraries. As if the issue of translation took, at the end, another turn. A more peaceful turn? A turn which assumes full responsibility of the posthumous reception. In full piety, that is to say, in love and respect, and distance consequently. As if a kind of soothing, of forgiveness was reached, in the same way as Portia defends in The Merchant of Venice, which Derrida considers as an emblem of the issue of translation, of the task and the depth of the translator. As if he, Derrida, from now on, had already forgiven any translation, having always already anticipated all the poker strikes or chess moves. Racing with posterity, as he will have kept racing with death his whole life, he will have lived, I quote him, in the imminence of the flashback end, end of quote. Overtaking himself, preceding himself dead, trying his best to translate his own ghost, arriving ahead of us on the edge of his grave in order to address the posthumous love letter and to smile at us. As if, at the end of the ends without end, gratitude was shown to the translation, enabling a double survival. The survival of the letter's body in a faithful and mournful memory, and the survival of the letter's spirit in a kind of divinely human elevation, Aufhebung. As if this would probably be the password of translation, the lips of which, with their irreconcilable edges, make a path, not for any benediction, but for the enigmatic and unconditional breath of what is to come. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Eduardo's Cadava's presentation will be following nicely what we just heard, as Professor Cadava is familiar with the enigma of translation, of translating in particular what Derrida himself used to refer to as his idioma, the unique way in which his writing makes his one and only French language work on itself. Because Eduardo Cadava has translated several works by Jacques Derrida, and he has also co-produced and co-edited a DVD entitled Unpacking Derrida's Library. He is a professor of English literature at Princeton University and an associate member of the university's Department of Comparative Literature, the School of Architecture, the Center for African American Studies, and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and I also want to thank Gayatri for bringing us all together. I first encountered Derrida's Of Grammatology as an undergraduate in 1978, 2 years after Gayatri's first translation appeared. I was taking an independent study course on William Gaddis's The Recognitions, and at a certain moment, as I was asking about the novel's exploration of issues of reproduction, repetition, citation, and writing, and the displacement of identity in general, the professor with whom I was taking the course told me that perhaps I should speak with some of the smarter faculty in the department, and that I should read something by a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida. I went directly to the library. I found Of Grammatology. I checked it out and began reading it. Or rather, I began reading Gayatri's preface. I have to say that reading this preface and then reading the book were a turning point in my intellectual trajectory. This was the moment in which I was first introduced to Derrida's work, and indeed to philosophy, since it was the first work of philosophy I had ever read. Although I suspect many philosophers would regard this as a sign of my bad luck, I always have felt that I was very lucky to have been introduced to philosophy in this way. At the same time, it was the first moment in which I encountered a trace of Gayatri, someone whom I later came to know in person, to love and admire. In a certain way, I would say I was introduced to Derrida through Gayatri, through the mediation of her preface. The book, there's a part of me that would prefer to describe the book as Derrida did, as an essay in two parts. An attempt, that is a try, a testing out, a preliminary gesture that has no guarantee of becoming a book. This is why the title of his first chapter is The End of the Book and the Beginning of Writing. Introduced several worlds to me. As Derrida says in it, we must begin where we are, and this is what I did. I began where I was, in a state of ignorance of most of his references, Descartes, Hegel, Peirce, Saussure, Bataille, Lévi-Strauss, Rousseau, and so forth. But wishing to overcome this ignorance, I began to read the text he was reading, and as time went by, and as I read more and more, I returned to Of Grammatology time and time again, and each time it offered me something different, as it still does now. To say this is to say that I'm an heir of this text, with all the contradictions and ambivalences that inheritance has in Derrida's work. The questions with which I often struggle, the paradoxes and contradictions that fascinate me, and for which I rarely find routes of exit or peace, these often have come to me in and through Derrida's works. It is a question of what I have inherited, of what an inheritance is, of what helps constitute us, of what an archive or library are. As Derrida puts it in the Grammatology, it is less a question of confiding new writings to the envelope of a book than of finally reading what wrote itself between the lines in the volumes. That is why, beginning to write without the line, one begins to reread past writing according to a different organization of space. Because we are beginning to write differently, we must reread differently, end quote. But this rereading is perhaps only beginning to be possible today. Walter Benjamin says as much in the notes to his essay, The Concept of History. Only the future has developers at its disposal that are strong enough to allow the image to come to light in all its details. Many a page in Marivaux or Rousseau reveals a secret sense which the contemporary reader cannot have deciphered completely. This historical method is a philological one whose foundation is the book of life. To read what was never written, says Hofmannsthal, the reader to be thought of here is the true historian, end quote. As Benjamin suggests, we have perhaps had to wait 40 years to be able to register the force and reach of Derrida's grammatology. It is perhaps only now that we can understand the ways in which this text anticipated and already comprehended so much of what was to come. The ways in which its reflections on writing and the trace would help us rethink our understanding of history, politics, democracy, sovereignty, ethnocentrism, nationalism, hierarchies of all kinds, and the act of reading itself. If we are here to mark the 40th anniversary of Gayatri's first translation of this work, to revisit this work to measure what we have inherited from it, what we continue to receive from it, we might remember that in his writings on Paul Celan, Derrida taught us how to think about anniversaries, about the singularity of dates, but also about their repetition. And what is being repeated today, among so many other things, is an invitation to read this new translation of a text, now and again, in order to think about the words that Derrida encouraged us to read, to engage, and to rethink. Books, dates, anniversaries, love, relations, language, translation, media, inheritance, singularity, repetition, mourning, memory, death, history, politics, religion, ideology, justice, democracy, university institutions, and particularly reading and writing. If we return to grammatology with you this afternoon, then, it is because we believe it remains a model and inspiration. It may even help us invent a tomorrow, imagine a future that will not simply be the repetition of the past. But if this is to be possible, we need to learn to read Derrida, to listen to him, and to do so at his rhythm. That is that of his voice, which is never just his. I would almost say his breath, which is also never just his. The phrase which is not even interrupted when it multiplies caesuras, asides, parenthetical remarks, signs of prudence and circumspection, hesitations, parentheses, quotation marks, italics, dashes, or all of these at once. I want to emphasize, though, that however impressive the coherence of this text might be, we shouldn't forget the extensive and highly differentiated range of fields traversed by Derrida's texts in general. Linguistics, literature, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, history, politics, psychoanalysis, music, art, and so forth, a range that prevents this coherence from taking the form of what philosophers might call a system. This is why the rule is not to avoid anything, never to pass by a question, a possibility, a necessity, never to miss a twist or a fold. We need to work at reading and rereading this difficult text with its phrases, quotation marks, and parentheses, and every other one it considers. Applying directives he imagined necessary for reading the writings of his friend, Philippe Lacoulabart, I would say that you need to work at going along with the work's strategies, its audacity, cunning, and prudence, and with the intractable necessity that constrains it, with its rhythm above all, as I said, its breath. Derrida turns to you, describes the ups and downs of terrain he knows well, interrupts himself, and then starts right in again, warns you of the risks involved, of pitfalls and traps waiting ahead, jumps you will have to take, of the stretch you cannot see yet, of the necessity of a detour, and of marking a different pace, end quote. of Grammatology is a training manual on how to read, and one that encourages us to understand the ethical-political stakes of this act of reading, an act of reading that is never just one. That is why, like the act of translation itself, this is a labor that has to be begun again and again. Nothing is or may be completed, not even writing, and perhaps especially writing. Nothing is closed. No sooner do we approach the text than the grammatological project already interrupts itself and points somewhere else. As we learn from grammatology, things are what they are only by bearing the trace of what they are not. Thinking itself is always caught within a weave of traces that needs to be engaged if it is to think at all. This engagement involves beyond the question of language, a question of temporality, and a question of the relation to the other. This is why we can say thinking proceeds essentially by reading, which is to say, by translation. Every word, every sentence, every essay or text desires to be translated, to live on, to survive, to be caressed and loved. Of Grammatology is no exception. If it desires to be translated, however, it is also because it can never be translated. It is rather, even before it encounters its translator, always in the process of being translated without ever being translated. And this even though it appears here in translation. Nevertheless, it is because a work remains untranslatable that it can be said to be translatable, that there is, in other words, a task for the translator. But the essential untranslatability of the work means that the translator can never know if she translates or even that she is a translator. She can never recognize herself in the act of translation. The task of the translator is therefore not to translate, if this means merely to transfer a meaning from one language to another, or to communicate the meaning of a text to someone who does not know another foreign language, but instead to remain faithful to the work's alterity, to its untranslatability, to enact within the very movement of her language her infidelity to the original. Indeed, it is only in relation to this infidelity that the translator can be said to translate at all, since it is what makes a new life for the original possible, what tells us that the original can change and become something else. As Benjamin would put it in the remarkable essay that he wrote to preface his translation of Baudelaire's Parisian Scenes, an essay famously entitled The Task of the Translator, translation must resist its desire to communicate something, its wish to render the sense of the original. The justification for a translation, he tells us, does not derive from the sense of what is to be conveyed, but from an act of translation that remains faithful to the mobility, strangeness, and incomprehensibility of both the original and language in general. The original is in fact only important to the translation insofar as it relieves the translator and her translation of the obligation to preserve a relation to it, to repeat it in another language. The original gives its translator the license to be unfaithful, the freedom to invent a relation to a language that is yet to come, and even to invent this language itself. If translation can only begin by departing from the original, however, it is also because, always coming after the original, it takes its point of departure not from the original's life, but from its survival or afterlife. That is to say, from a moment after the work already has been published, circulated, read, and mobilized in a series of heterogeneous contexts that have altered and continue to alter its shape and meaning. This is why a translation has no significance in relation to the original. It is always translating something other than the original. It is because the original only offers itself in this process of alteration and change that, according to Benjamin, there can be no translation that strives for likeness to the original. For in its afterlife, which could not be called that if it were not a transformation and renewal of something living, the original undergoes a change. Even words with fixed meanings can undergo a maturing process, end quote. This means that translation touches on the meaning of the original only by leaving it behind, by enacting its independence, its freedom to go off on a tangent, as it were, according to the laws that make a linguistic movement possible. Benjamin makes this point when he tells us that what meaning remains of significance in the relation between translation and original can be grasped in a simile. Just as a tangent touches the circle fleetingly and only at one point, and just as it is the touching and not the particular point that dictates the law according to which it is to continue on its straight path to infinity, so translation touches the original fleetingly and only at an infinitely small point of meaning in order to follow its own trajectory according to the laws of fidelity in the freedom of linguistic movement, end quote. Pointing to the structure of fidelity and freedom that characterizes the work of translation, he suggests that translation touches the original only to move away. The contact that takes place between the two texts in the process of translation is in fact always infinitesimal and fleeting. Nevertheless, however small and evanescent this point of contact may be, it has enormous effects on both the language of the original and that of the translation. If the original is always in a process of transformation, the act of translation also transforms the translator's mother tongue, and in so doing, gives her the right to invent a language that has never existed. For there to be translation, then, even the translation of what remains untranslatable, language must be changed and transformed. It must diverge from itself, and what this divergence ensures is language's strangeness and inexhaustibility. In this dispersal of meaning, translation does not transform an original foreign language into one we may call our own, but it instead renders radically foreign the language we believe to be ours. Indeed, all translation, Benjamin suggests, is only a somewhat provisional way of coming to terms with the foreignness of languages, end quote, including our own. If languages remain foreign to other languages and to themselves, it is because they unfold in time according to heterogeneous and discontinuous paths. Translation therefore tells us, if it can tell us anything at all, what is true of all texts. In addition, by setting the original in motion, by confirming and bearing witness to the fact that language and meaning can change, translation defetishizes, decanonizes, desanctifies, denationalizes, and deconstructs language. And it is here that we perhaps can register, even if only in a provisional and preliminary way, what we might call the politics of translation. It exposes the mobility, instability, and foreignness of language, and thereby prevents it and the sentence, essay, or text in which it takes place from becoming a fetish. Indeed, Benjamin notes, it is the task of the translator to liberate the language imprisoned in a work by transposing it, by recreating it beyond the limits of her own language. Linking the work of translation to the artistry with which language comes to mean something, rather than to what the language means, Benjamin not only evokes the greater language, which serves as the medium of translation, and is perhaps translatability itself, but also points to the love without which translation could never take place. To translate a work is to engage in a labor of love, in a movement or gesture of love. This gesture does not seek to reproduce or represent. It seeks, like all acts of love, to respect the work's infinite alterity and strangeness, to render its meaning fleetingly in all its fragmented and broken fragility, only at the point of contact, the infinitely small point of meaning, as a kind of kiss or caress. But as with all lovers, Benjamin reminds us, some are perhaps more worthy than others. The less value and dignity the original's language has, he tells us toward the end of his essay, the more it is communication, the less fertile a field it is for translation, until the utter preponderance of meaning, far from being the lever for a translation of distinctive form, renders it impossible, end quote. The impossibility of translation is here less a structural feature of all works of translation than the consequence of a text's prejudice toward communication, and in particular toward the communication of meaning. For Benjamin, however, the more untranslatable a work is, the more faithful it is to the mobility and strangeness of its language, the more it remains translatable, even if its meaning is touched upon only fleetingly, end quote. This means for us that the originals most worthy of being translated are those that most fiercely resist the work of translation, that most unwillingly surrender their sovereignty to another. This is why Kiki Dimula notes The only painless duty of the translator is bringing the dictionaries of two languages, strangers to one another, face to face, and forcing them to speak to each other. But her heaviest and most exhausting task, henceforth tantamount to an ex nihilo creation, is convincing a word to leave its country and entrust its meaning, great or small, to an unknown guardianship." End quote. May this text resist translation, and may it become, because of this resistance, worthy of the gifts bestowed on it by its translator and translation. Among so many others, the gift of time, survival, renewal, transformation, and love. May it also receive the gifts of this impossible translation with generosity, modesty, and gratitude. In the last interview that Derrida gave, published in Le Monde in August 2004, he claims that, quote, "Life is survival. To survive means to continue to live, but also to live after death." In regard to translation, Walter Benjamin underlines the distinction between afterlife on the one hand, to survive death, as a book can survive the death of an author, and on the other hand, living on to continue to live. All of the concepts that have helped my work, especially those of the trace or the spectral, were linked to survival as a structural dimension. Survival constitutes the very structure of what we call existence. We are structurally survivors, marked by the structure of the trace of the testament. Everything I have said about survival as the complication of the life-death opposition proceeds in me from an unconditional affirmation of life. Survival. This is life after life. Life more than life. The most intense life possible. End quote. Survival is perhaps another name for translation, and we all owe Gayatri a felt debt for the one now before us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ever since I had been invited to be moderator for this panel, I asked myself with perplexity, how am I going to introduce Gayatri Spivak? And I'm thankful to Avital to have just offered me the best way to do that. So now I would invite the Queen of the Five Boroughs to say a few words.
Thank you all. It is a time for me to be, is the mic picking me up? It is a time for me to be grateful. There's nothing really that I can say in response to these very rich presentations. Let me say that I was never introduced to philosophy. I cannot philosophize. I have always been before the door of philosophy, wondering. So the idea of wonderment was, the biographer was not so far away. So to an extent, let me, before I start thanking everyone, let me say that at the last thing that I did with Jacques Derrida, where Avital was indeed present, I said that I thought of myself as a stain on deconstruction, tâche, the French word. And I was thinking about Lacan's description of the subject in his wonderful essay on the gaze. And Derrida, in his infinite kindness and affection, said to me, you will remember, that the word tâche has two meanings. It is indeed a stain, but it's also a task. You carry the task of deconstruction. So in that spirit, as a servant of the text, that's really how I see myself as proceeding into a second encounter with the La Grammatologie. My gratitude is first and foremost to Derrida. Indeed, I did not encounter him at Cornell. Deman had not met Derrida when I was a student. I encountered, as it is very well known by now, I encountered the book by chance, by myself, when I was in Iowa. And I will share with you the fact that Derrida himself found this to be extremely interesting that somebody with no background in philosophy, who indeed never did come into philosophy properly, that she had, not knowing anything, been able really to like the book without the weight of the approval it already carried as a book by a young genius. He himself thought that, we talked about this a great deal, that this was a great tribute to him. And so I have also tried to remember that as I have taken up the task of retranslation. Now, my first act of gratitude then is to Derrida himself. There are certain things that he has taught me that I cannot ever forget. I quote, for example, very often the sentence, "It is just that there be law, but law is not justice." This is a remark, it was not in the Grammatology, but this is a remark that in order to understand this, you have to live life differently. That law is not justice. Enforcement of the law is not justice. It is just that there be law, but those buts that one inherits from Derrida. Avital, as you can see, my dear Queen, I am also crying, but I have heard you sing, and I sing as well. I'm not going to sing today, but as everybody knows here, I do sing very, very, very badly in public with my hand on my chest when I want to. Not today. But at any rate, so therefore my gratitude to Derrida overrides everything else. But I must also express my gratitude to my editor, my publisher, Matt McAdam, who's sitting right there, because he allowed me to retranslate. He allowed me to retranslate. He did not allow me to touch the damn translator's preface. I will say no more about it, but he did allow me to retranslate, and for that, much thanks, Matt. So therefore, the other thanks will go to Mireille for having come from France and to have told me about what I was doing when I was translating. I will talk about love, David, because I'm responding, yes? And it is not a reading with suspicion. It is a reading with love. Just let me retrace a few steps here. Some years ago, I was talking about how in deconstructive reading one actually is obliged to enter the text as well as possible, borrowing everything, I almost quote, borrowing everything from the text that is being supposedly critiqued in order to launch the critique. That particular gesture, I was trying to discover, look, this is very different. It's not like critical distance. It's not from outside. You enter into it in order. And Akbar Abbas, a friend of mine, also an Asian, not quite at home in the house of philosophy. It was in Taiwan that I was saying this. He says from the audience, he says, Gayatri, I'll give you the phrase for it, critical intimacy. Critical intimacy, not critical distance. This is the difficult charge of deconstruction. And to an extent, that particular task of entering into a text with something like love, achieving critical intimacy so that you can indeed not accuse, not excuse, but enter the protocol so carefully that perhaps you find a point in the text where it transgresses itself. And so you turn it around with great responsibility so that perhaps it can be used. So to that extent, it seems to me it is not a reading with suspicion at all. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, about Deman saying to Fred Jameson, Fred, you can only deconstruct what you love. This is a solid sentence, even if Deman never uttered it. But of course, one cannot hold language back, right? So therefore, we generally think of deconstruction these days as a sexy word for analysis. You break something up. First of all, reading with suspicion. Second of all, a sexy word for analysis. You just break the thing up. But that, and also you have deconstructive, in fact, I think what I'm wearing might have a deconstructive edge, right? You have deconstructed skirts and so on and so forth. So yes, language will go its own way. The word has entered the language to mean these kinds of things. But on the other hand, those who are wordsmiths, those who are paid to look after the house of language, we also have to say, hey. And from that point of view, I'll tell you something, Hamid. As I was doing this second time around translation, I was thinking of Ibn Rushd translating Aristotle with Aquinas in the wings to take it back, man. So to an extent, one can take a role model, right? I'm not comparing myself to Ibn Rushd. But that gesture of the stranger, of Akbar Abbas telling me from the audience, it's critical intimacy, of Abiola Irele standing here, sitting here right in front, and thanks to you, Biola, for coming. You know, we are together in our understanding. Professor Abiola Irele, with whom I'm working, in order to do what? Precisely to find in the mother tongues of Africa the kind of deconstructive gesture that Ben was in fact describing right at the beginning. So this man is my buddy because I read Derrida at some point, and he's taken the trouble to come and sit in the front row. Thanks. Another act of gratitude. So therefore, this particular feeling, even when we were teaching Derrida right at the beginning, in the 60s, in the Middle West, what did we point at? We pointed at, rightly or wrongly, we pointed at the fact that in order to consolidate any definition, you had to exclude. And what was it that you excluded? Ben spoke very correctly about the billions of people who, in fact, will not be able to accede to the way we are talking in this room. Do they not exist? To an extent, this particular concern, what do you exclude? That's what made me think of Aquinas standing in the wings, because that's where you Christianize Aristotle, make him proper. So to an extent, that particular gesture, the gesture of looking at the exclusions, of coming in from outside, of doing something which is not just love, but also, and here is Eduardo, love also brings with it the possibility of infidelity. I remember Barbara Johnson talking about translation as the translator as a faithful bigamist. Strong words, you know what I mean? So therefore, that whole business in testimony, I was there, I know. Somebody said this very recently, n'en parlons plus, but the thing is that when you actually give testimony, remember, that is also the opening of the parjure, of the possibility of not just perjury, that would be a bad translation, but nonetheless, this particular thing, this invitation to recognize that it is just that there be law, but law is not justice. This desire, this task, this is a very difficult thing in the contemporary world in order to understand how one would break from an unconstituted rule of law which governs the globalized world. So as I have said elsewhere, you know, the question, how can we be properly global, is not a serious question, because we are already globalized according to a certain rule of law, which is unconstituted because it's the law of capitalist globalization. That rule of law is not justice. It is just that there be law, but law is not justice. You cannot be simply subject to those laws by which you sit and stand globalized. Where did I get this from? I got it because I began thinking in this way. Don't forget, I come from an extremely solid, self-identical kind of culture. I'm an upper caste Hindu. So therefore, when I was reading Derrida and recognizing my parents, they had in fact broken the confidence in caste. My parents, in fact, had sung lullabies to us, which had said, do not, in fact, think that caste is a privileged thing. And so therefore, when I read this book in 1967, and on the first page was ethnocentrism, I began to realize something, because there is a very deep connection with Western metaphysics and what I would otherwise inherit if my parents had not warned me against identifying with that kind of inheritance. Today, in my country, I'm 87% majority, the caste Hindus are, and they would like, in fact, to destroy the Muslims. But how do I, in fact, think about it? I think about it in terms of this entering into, I love the Indic tradition, entering into that tradition, knowing it as well as I can, and then from inside finding some way of turning it around so that it can perhaps be used. That particular thing, and where do I find it? You will recall that I wrote a morning essay for Edward Said, which came out in Critical Inquiry. And in that essay, right at the end, I mourned with a Sanskrit text, where I said that there are things within my tradition which, in fact, go back before the Vedas that are so now celebrated by ignorant Hindu nationalists. And that is very much more like most religions, a kind of ecological celebration of the life that goes around in nature, whatever you call it. And it is that I was able to quote. So to an extent, this feeling of finding a moment in, and you will remember, Biola, you were not there. This was my first visit to Ilorin without you. But the Nigerian Academy of Letters was there. And our friend, our young friend, Hakim Alahumeta, he suddenly says, Professor Spivak will give the grace. And I thought, oh gee, Muslims and Christians, and I'm not even a religious person. What the hell am I going to say? And so, in fact, I went back again to that ecological, so pre-classical stuff that exists where, and in fact, the people from the Nigerian Academy said, yes, quite a lot like animism. And I remembered that in the, it was the Brahmarpanam, Brahmavi, that one. So I remembered that because I had dared to say this in Baroda, I was criticized very strongly by the Hindus there, because I had dared to say that if you go back far enough, it's like animism. No, animism belongs to the tribals. Now, who taught me to think like this? The guy who wrote, right in the first page of his book, ethnocentrism. That was not a very common word in 1967. So to an extent, the idea of being within a kind of enclosed circle from within which I can, in fact, celebrate this man was not on the agenda right from the beginning. I knew that I had read something which I didn't know. I was an outsider, and I thought the only thing I can do to this text is translate it, because translation, as you say, is a peculiar kind of labor. And the interview that you quoted, he begins by saying that you kill the text. You kill the text when you begin, because the sound is gone. So to an extent, that fact of translating a labor of love, an invitation to infidelity, an incredible responsibility so that the infidelity can be the contract of the marriage with the text, should not be broken. On the other hand, knowing that it will be broken, because there is no translation in the world that is not full of mistakes. I read translations all day because one is obliged to teach in English, as you said. We don't want the translation, we'll read it in English. So the one is obliged to teach in English. On the other hand, it is my conviction that you cannot, as a humanist, teach a text where you can't read the original. So I read originals and the translation together all day. And even the very great translations, in fact, the way in which they bring the so-called original to life is full of these extraordinary, what one is obliged to call errors. An entire history of consciousness is revealed by the things that are chosen. I mean, talk about Aristotle. In the translations of Aristotle, you cannot find in them any passage where the fact that this is not an Abrahamic text is respected by the Loeb translators. So what are you going to say about that? You are going to think about Ibn Rushd and Aquinas. So to an extent, this particular task then of translating the invitation not to be faithless, but at the same time to know that in every gesture it is an act of loving and hatred. Because I, in fact, as a comparative literature person, but that's what love is like. The one that just simply makes you feel good, that ain't love. So the tough love, awful phrase, awful American phrase, but hey, you find these expressions where you find them. So therefore, this particular idea that it's got you love as a comparativist, the original language, so-called. So to an extent, I even say that translation should not be a convenience, but rather an activity. I'm right on 20 minutes, am I not? Okay, so therefore I should end. So this is my end. I just say then, thank you to everyone. I want to talk much more, but I mean 20 minutes, I've already gone beyond 15. But my thanks also to Johan, who will play. Now, he's not just one of our students, but he's also a Juilliard product. He's a concert pianist. And he's going to play Chopin, but I should tell you that I have some of his Chopin stuff on my computer. And so when very late at night I'm feeling particularly troubled because I'm obliged to teach and yet I'm really, A, not a good teacher, B, never introduced to philosophy, I turn on his Chopin. So, but now it will be a more public gesture, and I look forward to it. So therefore, thanks all of you, my friends, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to Jacques, and thanks to Matt, and thanks to Biola, and thanks to everybody else. Thank you.
Magnifique. Thank you so much, Johan. Now I invite a couple of comments, questions before Gayatri gets to sign her book for you.
Hi, thank all of you so much. The order I said that didn't quite make sense. Thank you all so much. My question is for Ms. Spivak. As an Indian American woman, as an Indian woman immigrating to America, what sort of challenges did you face in navigating the world of academia filled with white men?
Well, listen, it's not a question about Derrida, right? But I will, as you can see, this
Right.
is connected. Now, first of all, I'm not an Indian woman who emigrated to America. I have only an Indian passport and a 55-year-old green card. I'm leaving. I mean, he said somebody's going to take a flight. I have to fly out tonight because I'm going to vote. And there's no absentee ballot. I vote in India. Okay, so therefore it's a different kind of question. But it is true that I am also, because citizenship is not just a piece of paper, having taught full-time for 51 years in this country, I am also, in that sense, a citizen of the United States. I don't vote, but I try to teach the intuitions of democracy as I understand them myself. Now, I did not face many problems early on, except tremendous sexual harassment, which was, very exotic I was. I will not mention the names of my professors because they're very well known, except I will say never demand. Demand was absolutely different from everybody else in never, ever even remotely having come close to anything. This I have to say, since he was my teacher. That's the only thing, because in the beginning, because I was very young. I was 19 years old when I came. And I came because I had been criticized at home because I had taken a position against my university. I was an editor. So therefore, I didn't go to Britain because I felt that I would have to take a second BA. And, I was young. My father was dead. I was like 18, 19 years old. I thought that's not correct. I already have a BA from the University of Calcutta. Why should I have to take a second BA at Oxford or Cambridge? I won't go to Britain. At that point, which was 4 years before Lyndon Johnson changed the law so that there was a 500% Asian influx, at my thing, it was not, I was completely protected by my innocence. I felt I knew everything. I felt there were no novels of how immigrants suffer, etc. around. I felt I really did not, what happened was I came in, and remember what I said, a very wonderfully brought up anti-casteist caste Hindu. I mean, I was ready. And also, what happened was I came into United States, which was, at least East Coast, which was reconstructing a kind of strange beatnik India, hippie India. I had never seen anything like that in my life. I threw myself into it, because after all, I was in literature. I was a good student. There was a fiction of India waiting for me. I sang on the harmonium with Allen Ginsberg. I went to Gary Snyder's Zendo. I mean, that was a different kind of time, okay? I'm not in front of my vice president going to say other things that I did, but it was, read. But at any rate, so therefore, but once I began teaching, very hard, because I started teaching 1965, all white department, the single person of color, male or female, so therefore, this was like, I couldn't believe the kind of, mind you, it was a good school, the upper administration loved me, but history is larger than personal goodwill. Who could take seriously a 23-year-old, good-looking, young, exotic Indian woman who had come in to teach at Baudelaire, Rilke, Yeats, etc., and not South Asia, European stuff? That was very hard. And then slowly, what I had faced also at home, Gayatri, she's such a good-looking, that was just like a total loss. Good-looking young girl, and so that's why the teachers love her. She's flashy, she doesn't, that was also at home. So therefore, what was I choosing between? The United States and India? No. And so therefore, when I came in and began this Derrida, my chairman said, why are you doing this? You're writing a nice book on Yeats, and so, you won't get anywhere with this unknown thing. David Heyman, God love him. And so when, as a result of this, I began to become well-known, you cannot believe the hostility and envy. You cannot believe the hostility and envy. So to an extent, what I have encountered in as difficulty is because, and then fierce tokenization, because I can speak English well, ethnocultural agenda, woman of color, and so therefore you didn't know, it was the other side of the same coin. You didn't know whether what you were doing, what you were being given was because you were good or because you were a token. So therefore, but the trouble is, if you remain too focused on your own problems like that, you'll get nowhere. Ultimately, it's amusing to see these people sniveling away because they're so envious. They show their own problems rather than mine. It is much more important to think about other people and not necessarily of your own group and look below rather than look up. And another tiny story, because I didn't get to talk about my mom. I must, a tiny story. There was a consul here in New York who was an English MA, and she had been a student of my good friend Meenakshi Mukherjee's. So she invites us to a session on leadership or domestic violence against South Asian women or something. It was either leadership or domestic violence, I forget which one. But anyway, so we are all sitting there. We're making noises about South Asian women. Gauri Vishwanathan was there. And my mother was here visiting me. Old lady, she had cancer of the jaw, so she couldn't wear teeth, toothless old lady, nicely dressed. But, in a white sari and so on. But the consul thought, to be polite, she's the oldest person there, that she should say something to her. And, she would probably say something embarrassing or Mickey Mouse or not be able to speak English or whatever. But, So the consul turns to her, the last person, says, Mrs. Chakravorty, anything? And she says, you should think about people other than South Asians. My mother became a US citizen because my brother brought her over and wanted her to be his dependent. She was an indefatigable social worker in India. When she came here, and she was in her 70s, and she thought, I have changed my civil society. I'm a citizen now. I must do something for this place. And so she gave more than 10,000 hours of voluntary labor for post-traumatic syndrome Vietnam War veterans. So we were encouraged to think not just of our identity group, but of people in general. And I see, Gora, you've come, thank you very much, and you're agreeing. You probably have heard this story. But people of other groups who is excluded, there you are, and also people below, and also people like in the rape things that happen. I work with subalterns, right? So I'm quite interested in the proper in the class apartheid education, so that men are taught correct also, so that they don't think that rape culture and bribe culture are normal. So therefore, I appreciate your question. I certainly faced problems. I described them. But ultimately what I would say is we should not think about only hurts to us, and we should not think only about hurt to our identity group, our class group. We should be thinking about other people. That's democracy, not voting blocs. And we should also look below to see problems rather than above to see who's not giving us what we should have. It's a long answer, but then nobody has any questions, and so I thought I would give you a long one. It's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There is a gentleman here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gianni Gustave. I'm a senior at CUNY York College, and I'm an immigrant from Haiti. It's a privilege for me to be here, Ms. Chakravarti, and my question will be, do you look up a lot to Francophone Caribbean writers and North African Francophone Caribbean writers? And if you have a close relationship with any of these writers, did they have any critiques about your retranslation? And my
critiques of what?
Critiques about your retranslation.
Yes. What are you referring to?
If they, I'm referring to your book, actually. Yes. A Francophone perspective. Thank you for correcting me on your work. And my follow-up question would be, who are the key figures that you look up to in these regions as well?
Okay, I am not a great looker-upper, frankly. So that's something that I mean, I think of Karl Marx as my brother and my friend, rather than someone I look up to, you know what I mean? So therefore, I don't really look up a great deal, but Caribbean, Aimé Césaire, obviously. I've translated, in fact, Bashir introduced the translation, and I'm very moved by the way in which Haiti stands as, you know, I mean, we cut our teeth on the Black Jacobins, Cilla James's book. So Haiti stands as a kind of example. But on the other hand, I will also say that it gets sometimes monumentalized. And I think, therefore, if one begins to look at the way in which Haiti was, which is why I gave you those pages from the Economic and Political Weekly, the way in which Haiti was completely destroyed right from the start, you know, after the establishment of independence, that's the thing that we should look at, so that it was still paying back debts for having succeeded down to 1948, and still does. So that's, in fact, I'm a political person. That's what I look at. And I will say about Toussaint Louverture that he was, in fact, in my understanding, and it may not be perfect at all, you know, but one can read, one can think, that he was, in some ways, like I was talking about deconstructive reading, you enter the structures of whatever you are critiquing. So, who knows this better than immigrants to metropolitan spaces? They are the great deconstructors of the metropolitan cultures that they enter. And so, to an extent, Toussaint was an unbelievable example of the European Enlightenment. You see his pictures. And then he expected that Corsican bandit to be European. And of course, he did not encounter the European Enlightenment in Napoleon. So therefore, what do we learn from that? That you don't, and I'm now quoting Marx and Engels, criticizing their Communist Manifesto, when he, in the 1872 preface, which I have quoted at great length all over the place, when they say that readers should disregard their stuff on revolution. Please disregard, they write in that last preface, everything in the Communist Manifesto that is about the revolution, because we saw 1848, we saw 1871, the failure, and what do they say about 1871? And I thought immediately about Toussaint and Napoleon. They say that 1871, the Paris Commune, taught us that you cannot take on a state machinery and expect it to work as it would work. You cannot take the Enlightenment model. You're not Jacobins. You're black Jacobins. So to an extent, that particular lesson that they said, and then they said something which was, I thought about, as you said, again, I'm not comparing myself to Marx and Engels. They said, but we are, and they said other things that should be ignored. But then they said, this text is a historical text. We feel that we do not have the right to change it. We feel that we do not have the right to change it. This is how they described the Communist Manifesto in a postface that comes with the final publication of the manifesto. And that, to my mind, also carries a lesson about today monumentalizing Haiti. Because those of us who actually were born in colonial spaces, we use the word post-colonial ironically, because the moment there was independence, decolonization began to fail. Why? There it is, 1871. You cannot take over a state machinery and expect, who knows it better than the Indian Union? You cannot take over a state machinery and expect it to work well immediately. So that's how I feel about Haiti, even as I feel that it's a model. And as for Caribbean writers, Aimé Césaire, but the one who really breaks my heart is, of course, Wild Boy from Martinique, Fanon. Fanon is, the idea that Fanon died when he was 36 is something that just, it's a loss that I live every day as I see his predictions coming true in the contemporary world, which he described, the failure of the modern, which he described in the second part of The Wretched of the Earth, which hardly anyone reads because Sartre only read the first chapter and too quickly. So that's my Caribbean. Fanon.
Thank you very much. I'm very thankful for these two wonderful questions, because obviously what you just say, Gayatri, we needed to hear from you as well. So now I will invite all of you to purchase your copy of the second translation, the new translation.
Can I quote Stanley Fish? I met him, Avi has objected, but I'm doing it nonetheless. He said to me in 1977, that book is more purchased than read. So I said to Stanley, it's better than being more read than purchased. So prove him right. It puts bread on my table.